Luck can play a big part in how easy or difficult even the simplest of things can be. For example, getting into your car. That can come down to the luck of how closely someone else has parked next to you. And the Great British Driving Test is no different. It can be as easy as a walk in the park to feeling like you're being attacked from all angles. And this brings me on to something that I disagree with. You could do 2 driving tests and you could deal with the exact same situation in the exact same way. One would be a fail and one would be a pass. What's the difference? Cars following you. Here are 2 examples based on real tests that I have witnessed. Of course, I don't have the actual footage of the test. I don't film tests, but I've come here to explain what happened. On this road, there's a traffic calming measure, and my pupil slowed down and gave way to oncoming cars, as I'm going to now. There is an oncoming car, so I'm waiting. But there was an opportunity, actually similar to the one that we have now, definitely big enough for her to go, but she didn't take it. And the examiner marked her down for not taking it. I do not disagree with that. She got a minor for it and she still passed the test. The trouble I have is what the examiner said at the end of the test. During the driving test, you're not expected to take the most challenging of opportunities that experienced drivers take. I mean, you can if you like, but why would you? It's more risky. You are expected to take gaps in traffic that a driver with reasonable skill can take. Not really quick skill, I can move the car quickly, but the sort of skill that someone at test standard would have after driving for hours, not years. So, my pupil, to be fair to the examiner, did miss an easy opportunity that I would expect her to take at her level of driving, test ready. So she got a driver fault for it, for missing that gap. Everybody else calls them minors. I don't have a problem with that. In fact, she still passed the test. But at the end of the test, the examiner said to her, if there were a queue of cars waiting behind her, she would have failed. What is that telling my pupil? That's telling her to succumb to the pressure, to go because there's cars behind. That's the opposite of what I teach. Surely one of the differences between a good driver and a not so good driver is not to feel pressured. A good driver listens to their judgment and goes when they feel safe, but a not so good driver or even a bad driver succumbs to that pressure and takes risks. Goes because they feel pressured from cars behind as opposed to feeling sure that it's safe to go. Here is another example, Ambrose Avenue. My pupil was queuing behind this black car because there was oncoming cars. It was actually a queue of oncoming cars that included a stationary bus. And she was waiting here because she didn't feel comfortable going through the narrow gap next to the bus. But the queue was not moving. And it wasn't long before the examiner asked her to go through the gap, which she did. And she did it well without knocking the wing mirrors. Even though it was a narrow gap, that would make me feel uncomfortable. So she did a good job. She was obviously good enough at driving the car and positioning herself to get through such a narrow gap. Yet she failed. At the end of the test, the examiner explained to my pupil the reason why they failed was because there was a queue of cars behind them and they needed to move forwards and make progress. But that was a narrow gap, a very narrow gap that would make me feel uncomfortable. I would be happy waiting for the oncoming cars to proceed and the bus to move out of the way so that there's more space and then go through. I wouldn't put my pupil under pressure to take gaps they're not sure about, let alone ask them to go through the narrow gap. They do it flawlessly and then fail them. Most tests don't come up against such a difficult situation. So during that test, my pupil was unlucky and I think it's a bit unfair. What I don't like about passing someone because there was no queue of cars behind them, but in the same situation failing them because there was a queue of cars behind them, is it puts driving instructors under pressure to teach that way, to pressure new drivers to go because of traffic behind. But that's the opposite of what I do. I try to teach my pupils to listen to their judgment and only go when they feel safe. And I also expect new drivers to drive a bit more slowly and to take bigger opportunities. That's why we have P plates after they pass, because you cannot expect someone with tens of hours of experience to drive at the same standard as someone who's even just been driving for 6 months or a couple of years or 10 years, 20 years. It's unrealistic. Once you start ignoring your own judgment and succumbing to pressure from other cars, things start to get unsafe. It's important to only go when you feel comfortable, and as you get more experienced, you'll feel more comfortable more often. You'll take smaller gaps and you will drive at higher speeds, within the speed limit, of course. I think driving examiners should be more lenient on the more challenging tests. I don't think they should let pupils off for being unsafe, but if it's clear it's a challenging drive, maybe be a bit more lenient towards things like missing opportunities or going a bit slow, or even give them a bit of encouragement. Some examiners do that. It's not as if driving is getting any easier. I think it's getting harder. I think it was easier to pass your driving test back in 2004 when I passed, not least because there was less rules in the highway code to follow, but there was less traffic. And from what I hear, back in 1987 when I was born, it was easier still. But I don't know that because I couldn't drive in 1987. Although, back in the early 90s, I did have a foot-powered car. Didn't handle very well, mind you. The steering felt somewhat disconnected, but it did get going quickly if my big sister gave it a push. What I find especially frustrating is that I've heard from more than one person from the DVSA that if you can pass your driving test in one town at one test centre, you can pass it in any town at any test centre, and it doesn't matter what time you take your driving test. But that's clearly not true. You can look at the statistics. You are more likely to pass in some places than others, and depending on what time you take your test, well, that's going to determine how difficult the driving test is based on the traffic. Even though, in my experience, you're more likely to fail a driving test if there's a queue of cars waiting behind you, don't succumb to the pressure. Listen to your own judgment. Go when you think it's safe. That way you'll make better decisions and you will be safer. Once you start second guessing yourself, you won't know what to do. Well, I hope you found this video helpful and interesting. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're looking for car insurance, check out the links to Collingwood and Confused in the description. If you're learning to drive and want to insure yourself on somebody else's car so that you can have some extra practice, Collingwood are there for you because you can do so without affecting the owner's policy. And via the link at the moment, there's up to 35% off and a £20 Amazon gift card. If you're insuring your own car, I recommend checking out confused.com. It's who I use when I'm insuring my own car. You fill out one quote form and get loads of quotes back from many insurers to compare who's cheapest. And something else I like is that if you're shopping around for a different car, you can change your car in that quote as many times as you like without having to redo the whole quote. So it's a really handy way to see how much it costs to insure different cars. Using the links doesn't cost you anything, but it does support the channel. So thank you very much. Subscribe to get my future videos, and until the next one, cheerio.